A man is walking through an olive grove at night with soldiers behind him, and in his hand he is holding the one weapon nobody expects him to use: a kiss. The torches are still far off when he steps ahead of the guards, alone, into a garden he knows better than they do, because he has slept there before, with the other 11, under the same trees, believing the same things they believed. And now he crosses the grass toward the one man in the world who trusted him completely, leans in, and presses his lips to that man's cheek. That kiss has a name now. We use it for every betrayal, in every language, in every century since. But almost nobody who says it knows the man behind it. His name was Judas. And there is a field outside Jerusalem that still carries the weight of what he did. A field with a name so specific, so brutal, that once you understand why it's called that, you will never read this story the same way again. We'll get there. But not yet. Here's what most people miss about Judas. He wasn't a stranger who wandered in from outside. He was chosen. Out of every person in Judea who could have followed Jesus, Judas Iscariot was handpicked, by name, to be one of the 12. If you had stood in that crowd the day Jesus called his inner circle, you would have seen Judas walk forward like anyone else. No warning sign on him, no mark that set him apart. The word Iscariot likely comes from Ishkarioth, man of Carioth, a town down in Judea. That detail matters more than it sounds. Every other disciple in that group was a Galilean, a fisherman or a tradesman from the north, rough accents and rougher hands. Judas was the outsider among insiders, the one who came from the capital region, from the world of politics and religion and power, while the others came from lake towns nobody in Jerusalem had heard of. You can imagine what that felt like. 3 years on the road with 11 men who all understood each other's jokes before Judas did. 3 years of being just close enough to belong, and just different enough to wonder if he really did. Somewhere in those 3 years, Judas became the treasurer. He carried the money box for the group. Food, lodging, gifts for the poor, all of it passed through his hands. And this is where the Gospel of John says something quiet but devastating. When a woman named Mary poured expensive perfume over Jesus' feet, Judas objected, loud and righteous, asking why it wasn't sold and given to the poor instead. If you had been standing there, it would have sounded like conviction. It would have sounded like the most reasonable objection at the table. John tells you it wasn't. John says Judas didn't care about the poor at all. He was a thief, and he used to help himself to what was in the box. Stay with me, because this is the part that should unsettle you. Judas didn't start as a monster. Nobody starts as a monster. It wasn't a knife in the dark. It wasn't a plan drawn up in advance. It wasn't even hatred for Jesus. He started as a man with a small compromise, a little money taken here, a little there, justified in the moment, buried under a title, treasurer, that made it look responsible instead of what it was. You've probably made a version of that same compromise yourself, on a much smaller scale, and told yourself it didn't count. That's exactly how it starts for everyone. And here's where it gets stranger. Luke's gospel doesn't say Judas simply decided to betray Jesus. Luke says, then Satan entered into Judas, not manipulation from the outside only. Something let in. A door that had been left open for years, probably one small theft at a time, until there was nothing left to stop what walked through it. He went to the chief priests, not soldiers, not Rome. The religious leaders who had been looking for a quiet way to arrest Jesus without starting a riot during Passover when the city was packed with pilgrims. And Judas offered them exactly what they needed, a way to find Jesus alone, away from the crowds who might defend him. They agreed on 30 pieces of silver, not a fortune. In fact, it was the exact price the law of Moses set for a slave who'd been gored by someone else's ox. 30 pieces of silver was the value of a life nobody considered fully human. Whether Judas noticed that insult or not, the prophets had noticed it centuries earlier. The prophet Zechariah once wrote about a shepherd being paid the very same sum, thrown back into the temple treasury in disgust. Judas didn't know he was walking into a scene that had already been written. Here's the part nobody tells you. At the Last Supper, Jesus already knew. He didn't need Judas to confess. Picture yourself at that table, reclining shoulder to shoulder with 12 men you've traveled with for 3 years, and one voice you trust completely says that one of you will betray him. He looked around the table at 12 men eating bread together, and he said one of them would betray him, not with anger, with grief. And when Judas asked, "Surely not I, Rabbi?" Jesus answered him directly, not in code, not to the others, but to Judas alone. Then Jesus did something almost unbearable to watch. He dipped a piece of bread and handed it to Judas himself. In that culture, sharing bread from your own hand was an act of honor, of friendship, of trust. Jesus extended that trust one final time, at the exact moment he knew it would be used against him. Then he said 6 words to Judas. "What you are about to do, do quickly." Judas got up from that table and walked out into the dark. John's gospel adds a detail almost too quiet to notice. It was night, not just outside, inside him too. Hold that thought, because there's a detail here most translations bury. The Greek word used throughout this story for what Judas did to Jesus is paradidomi, to hand over, to deliver up. It's a hard word, a cold word, and yet that same Greek word appears elsewhere in the New Testament describing what God the Father did with his own Son on the cross. Judas handed Jesus over out of greed and darkness. And somehow, in a mystery none of the writers try to fully explain, the same act became the very thing that accomplished a rescue Judas never intended. Now watch what happens in the garden. Judas arrives with soldiers, with torches, with a plan, and he kisses Jesus. A signal agreed upon in advance, so the guards would know which man to seize in the darkness and confusion. Imagine that moment from where you're standing. Jesus doesn't pull away. He looks at Judas and asks him one devastating question. "Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" Not "how could you?" Not even outrage. Just sorrow, aimed directly at the one man in the group who still had time to stop. He didn't stop. The soldiers took Jesus, and Judas walked away with money in his hand and something else entirely gone from his chest. Here's the takeaway most people never sit with. The next morning, when Judas saw that Jesus had actually been condemned, something broke in him. Matthew's gospel says he was seized with remorse. He ran back to the chief priests, threw the 30 silver coins onto the floor of the temple, and said, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." The priests didn't care. They told him that was his problem now, not theirs. And this is where we come back to that field. The priests wouldn't put blood money back into the temple treasury, so they used it to buy a plot of land. A potter's field, used for burying strangers who died with no one to claim them. And Judas, in his grief, went out and ended his own life. Matthew tells us he hanged himself. The book of Acts, written later by Luke, adds a second, harsher detail. That Judas fell headlong, and his body was broken open in that same field. Ancient writers struggled to reconcile the two accounts, and honestly, so do modern scholars, but both agree on where it happened and what it meant. That field became known by a new name in the local Aramaic language, Akeldama, the field of blood. It's the field we mentioned at the very beginning of this video. The one whose name would only make sense once you understood the man behind it. There's one more detail worth knowing, one you won't find in the Bible itself. An early Christian writer named Papias, who lived not long after the apostles, recorded an even more graphic tradition about Judas's final days. A body swollen beyond recognition, unable even to pass through a street wide enough for a wagon. Whether every detail is historically precise or not, it tells you something true about how the earliest Christians remembered him, not as a tragic footnote, as a warning. Because here's what this story is actually about, underneath all of it, and it's worth sitting with. Judas wasn't given a smaller invitation than Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times that same night and still became the rock the church was built on. Judas wasn't offered less grace, not less access, not less love, not a shorter table to sit at. He walked away from the same table, ate the same bread, heard the same voice. The difference wasn't the offer. It was what he did with the guilt once it came. Peter wept and turned back. Judas despaired and turned inward, alone, until there was nowhere left to go. If you take one thing from this video, let it be this. 3 things are worth carrying with you. First, betrayal rarely starts as betrayal. It starts as a small compromise, nobody's watching, a coin here, a coin there, until the compromise has more control than you do. Second, being close to Jesus, sitting at his table, hearing his voice, was never a guarantee of anything on its own. Closeness is not the same as surrender, and you can be near the truth every single day without ever surrendering to it. And third, the door Judas walked through in his final hours was despair, not the size of his sin. Peter's sin that night was public and cowardly. Judas's was calculated and financial. Neither one was smaller than the other. Only one of them turned back toward the light instead of running from it. The 11 remaining apostles later chose a replacement, a man named Matthias, to complete their number again. Life went on for the movement Judas tried to stop, but his name never left the story, carved permanently into a field outside Jerusalem and into every language that still uses his kiss as the symbol for the worst kind of goodbye.